Thank you. And I don't think you realize how much I say to you. Thank you. But I will say that again at the end. I suggested yesterday that paragraphs 24 to 40, since they all talk in several different ways about how to cover sin with good works, that we would find something very similar by paying attention today to paragraphs 41, or rather, I will skip 41 and 42, 43 to the end. Why did Ambrose decide to write two apologies? His apology for David and David's apology for himself. And I think part of the answer can be found in Ambrose's life. Because early in his life, he was governor, lawyer, a man of state. And so he needed to have a legal proceeding in order to be able to set up the possibility of a Christian or spiritual reading that goes beyond Ambrose and begins to be that which David himself would have made. But since in a legal proceeding, the one who is accused usually has to wait, so the second part of the Apologia David is David's chance to plead his own cause. You may not have noticed, but in the first 40 paragraphs of the Apologia David, Psalm 50 is only cited at the very end, where two phrases from the psalm are used, as it were, to bring the first apology, the first reflection, to an end. And the second one opens in a very strange way. But strange at least to us, to me. Because he first wants to talk about the number 50. And since most of us are not accustomed to theories of numbers, numerology or numerologia, or however one wants to say it, there is such a huge philosophy around numbers that in that culture it did make sense to say Psalm 50 is important because of its number and then because of its title. When I pick up the Psalms to read, I don't usually think first about the number, and I never read the title because the titles are not in the prayer book. But in Ambrose's Bible, the title was that which allowed him to begin to say, this is perhaps not in the right place because, and he does some historical thinking, and then he says, but the number 50 has significance for these reasons, and then he cites some passages from Scripture. He cites the day of Pentecost, and he says, okay, now we can begin. The preliminaries have said 50 is right in the middle. So it's at the heart of what it means to think about forgiveness. And then he can begin with a long quotation from Psalm 50, and kind of amazed, as it were, that David would spend so many words putting himself forward as sinner. Because that is the way it all begins. It will take me a little bit longer since I have to hold the microphone this time. Have pity on me, he says, "Have pity on me, Seigneur, Lord, according to your great mercy. And because of the multitude of your forgivenesses, of your pardon, take away my iniquity. Wash me fully of my injustice. Purify me of my fault." Now, you might remember that I've said a couple of times that the language of the words used for sin are many. And it doesn't appear that there is much reflection on which word to use when. It almost seems like they need to use two words because you can't say peccatum and then say peccatum again. You have to say peccatum and culpa, or peccatum and errore, or what. But one of the strong distinctions that is in Ambrose is something that you will have read in preparing for today, between peccatum and iniquitas. Because Ambrose is deeply influenced by the Stoic tradition. And the Stoic tradition makes a big deal out of what one might call the grades or the stages of evil. There's some evils that are more superficial, and there are some that are more deep in the way that Ambrose will appropriate this Stoic way of thinking. And so sin is the articulation of some deeper evil, some iniquitas that lies there within. And it's almost less important to think about the sin than it is to speak about the heart from which it came, the iniquitas that has somehow seized the inner person. And we will find him making that more and more explicit in the first several paragraphs of this second part, as he tries to now not just apologize for David, but to show how David is really at the more superficial level when it comes to the sin. And so the court proceedings, the things that happened before the law in the first 40 chapters, now begin to take on a more different, a more spiritual character. Because it isn't now just a matter of defending what David did, as it is a matter of explaining what it means to be Christian. And I don't want to underemphasize that. Explaining what it means to be Christian. Because if we think that some of the evil deeds that people do are simply articulations of an evil core, of iniquitas deep within, that is just expressing itself, we may be right, or we may be wrong. But since Ambrose wants to make David a Christian before Christ, he wants to, as he did in the law courts now, but now in a spiritual way, talk about his sin as not fully a part of some deep wrong within, because David has been washed. Lave-moi abondamment de mon injustice, purifie-moi de ma faute. So from the first words of Psalm 50, we have in some ways the depth of the meaning of the prayer itself. And Ambrose is not going to get lost in extraneous reflections in this section of the Apologia David, because Psalm 50 helps him walk through it, and all of the things that he needs to say as a Christian are there. And so now, instead of a let's call it a rational approach, a logical approach of moving from the presentation of the case and the exculpation of the sinner. Now he's just following the rhythm of the Word of God. And the rhythm is articulated by the words of Psalm 50. So far, so good? Make good sense? I don't know how I caught that. We will find in this prayer called Psalm 50 how Ambrose makes the Christian elements stand out. A question to keep in mind: how much of the legal proceeding that we spent the last 2 days talking about is still here? How does he marry, pull together, relate the court proceeding to the prayer? The role and presence of the Holy Spirit, by the time we get to the center of Psalm 50, will take on an added importance. So it will come forth now not as a kind of defense of the Trinity, but as an articulation of the human spirit. And throughout, there's a kind of a heightened interiority. I recently listened to the talk of a professor from Yale University. And he said with many words, speaking of American students, they do not have a language of interiority, a language to talk about what goes on within. So we're very good at texting, at having fun, at doing things that are, as it were, external, but we aren't given a lot of opportunities to think about how we put into words the things that are within. And so a kind of a parallel reflection or a parallel way of thinking about the way Ambrose speaks of Psalm 50 is to ask, why do I find some of the things that Ambrose is saying foreign? Is the difference in our cultures so great that finding a language about sin, finding a language about my sin, is much more challenging than it would have been in a culture deeply influenced by philosophies of Platonism, Neoplatonism, Stoicism, and other many categories of thought. Because even though Ambrose is a Christian, he needs the language of his time. And no matter how Christian we are, we need the language of our time. So part of the process of trying to read what Ambrose says about Psalm 50 is to recognize the gap between our time and Ambrose's time, between who we are and who Ambrose was, between the way we use words and the way they use words. And so, in order to think about this as not merely an articulation of a Christian spirituality, but as the challenge of a contemporary philosophy, I think the question that I just asked is pretty important. What are the words that we in this 21st century use to articulate what goes on within? how does it relate to my email, to my texting, to my ways of communicating, to that which I give, to that which I receive? So I didn't, and so even though I'm a Catholic priest, and even though I'm very comfortable talking about things of spirituality, always somebody else's spirituality, of course, but it seemed to me that to frame this understanding as also philosophical has a deeply historical importance. Meaning this isn't just about you and me and this class. Ever since the scholastics began to say the only important question is how we organize our thinking, even though that's not exactly what they meant. But it seems to be the way we've taken it. The Western world has tended to have a school of theology, a school of philosophy, a school of history, a school of literary criticism, meaning we've divided things up so that we fail to recognize that theology is philosophy, philosophy is history. All of this is in some way the articulation of the human spirit. How do I use my mind in a way that doesn't forget my heart and that necessarily includes my listener? How do I make sure that as I try to read Ambrose, I don't get caught in the problem of saying, that belongs in the school of, or that belongs in this other school. Because those are our times, those are not Ambrose's times, but that kind of a question makes it hard to think about this as not just spirituality, but also spirituality, not just philosophy, but also philosophy. And to try to pull it together, not as a way of saying, what does it mean to be Christian alone? What does it mean to think about the human experience of failure? Where I know I did something of which I am ashamed. And how do I make sure that that is part of the way my head and my heart and my communication happen? Then I think the reading of Psalm 50 takes on truly a challenging character, because it can't be neatly classified as something that belongs to one school or another school. And pause for a minute. You're in the spotlight. And just say, are there any observations or questions that would be fruitful for you to add at this moment? Okay. Save them for the next moment. I should ask one other question. Balancing paper, microphone, and text is not going to work really well. Does everyone have the text in front of them? Is there anyone who does not have the text in front of them? So I don't even have to worry about what's on the screen then. Oh, that's a relief. So paragraph 43 quoted this long phrase from Psalm 50. Who among us, even if he or she confesses his fault, doesn't think that he doesn't really want to go back over and back over and back over that fault, but wants to move on? But look how many verses this great prophet used to faire retentir, to express his sin. And all of them contain an expression of his fault. So David, as one who pleads, en suppliant, asks for one sin, or at least one set of sins, a multitude of pardons. And we, because Ambrose wants to be pastoral and talk to the people who are listening to him, we barely think that we better ask even once that God show us mercy. And even more than that, just as God freed his people from Egypt as they crossed the river, that which was a figure of baptism, well, that great figure is also a figure of sacraments. So how much more should that great mercy of God show itself? C'est donc avec raison qu'est ici demandé aussi une multitude de pardons, là où il y a une multitude de pécheurs. So he wants to put together the simple recognition of fact. We are all sinners. And therefore, asking for pardon a multitude or many times is important. Lave-moi, paragraph 44, purifie-moi. Right away, Ambrose jumps into this gradations of evil, or better, gradations of pardon. He doesn't ask so much to be forgiven often, and here uses the language of de l'être pleinement. So whether it's it's not a question of the number of times, but the depth of washing. So there at the bottom of page 129, le sacrement de baptême, comme l'enseigne le Seigneur Jésus en personne, is that which is the means of purification, because that's what was preached by John the Baptist. So his first view, his first understanding of the meaning of the initial verses of Psalm 50 are found in that paragraph 44. In multum lava me ab injustitia mea. But sometimes, he goes on, people might want to explain that in a different way. And I hope you noticed, as you read through this development that Ambrose makes, that every once in a while, that is at least 3 or 4 times, he says, here's an explanation, but there's also another. Meaning, instead of being required to have only one explanation of this or that verse, he finds a way to say, people interpret this in different ways. Because he has the advantage, the benefit of having read Origen's interpretation of Psalm 50, and Didymus the Blind's interpretation, and perhaps other interpretations of the psalm. So the only thing that matters to him is not, this is the way to answer it, but this is one way to answer it, and this one is no less true, even though it's different. Si quelqu'un veut comprendre le texte autrement, il peut former ainsi son exégèse. And then he goes on with another exegesis. And in that second thing, he's worried about the language of purification. Because if we talk about good works covering over sin, if the good works are the covering for peccatum, it's presuming that the iniquitas is not dominant. And so now what looked like in the first part of the work as a neat way to get David off the hook, to say, well, he wasn't really responsible in the way that we think he was. Now we begin to see that he's got a very specific, even carefully crafted understanding of the difference between peccatum and iniquitas, between being washed and being purified. And Psalm 50 allows him, with the language of purification, not just to talk about baptism, but even to talk about sin. And therefore, to cut across the merely legal argument of getting David, of freeing David from his responsibility, to a more Christian argument, where the good works do in fact cover the sin because the purification has taken place at a certain depth. And so this sense of being washed and purified through baptism isn't just a matter of saying, we washed away original sin, we were forgiven all of our sins. It's a way of something deeper happens. Something happens deeply within. So that when I or you meet another person, instead of saying, oh, that's a bad person, to start with, even if they've done something that I find unacceptable or even insulting, I have to meet that person long enough to know whether there's real evil or whether it's just sin. Who would have thought that we could say if it was just sin, right? But that is what Ambrose's interpretation of this psalm is leading us toward. So in paragraph 45, la parole divine purifie. Notre confession purifie. La première purifie quand on l'écoute, le second quand on l'articule. Une bonne pensée purifie, une belle action purifie. So good thoughts are a source of purification. Good actions are a source of purification. Comme aussi la pratique d'une bonne conduite purifie par tout cela. Purifié, so already cleansed by all of that. Chacun a plus de facilité pour s'imbiber de la splendeur de la grâce spirituelle. So he's not going to leave us waiting for halfway through the development of this second part to be thinking about what is this spiritual grace. We aren't going to have it kind of given to us in small doses. There's a sense where right from the beginning his concern has put on the table not only the sin and the depth of sin, but purification and the depth of purification and the gift of grace as being part of that. So he uses several images, but it's not just, I'm going to do something. My doing something has an interior effect. It's not just doing good works, it's that the good works make a difference in how I do them. Paragraph 46. Et c'est pourquoi il ajoute, car je reconnais mon iniquité, et ma faute est toujours contre toi. I know my iniquity. I know the depth of the evil in me. And my fault, my sin, is always in front of my face, because my sin is an action. Ce n'est pas une petite chose que quelqu'un connaisse son péché. We already know that from things that we've talked about before. Partway down, most people, or many people, la plupart, he says la plupart, but he really means most, not or many but not most, se glorifient. They brag about their falls, their conquests, the things that they do that they know are bad. Et estime que mérite la louange des actions qui méritent la reproche. Conscience is a really hard thing to form. What is it that is good? What is it that is bad? How do I make sure I'm always choosing from within the right thing? Because in Ambrose's time, as in ours, the wrong things get put out there as things to brag about. And think that some things should be praised, which really should be criticized. And then he gives a small list of things there that go from stealing to raping to doing crazy stuff. De tous ces gens-là, aucun ne peut dire, car je reconnais mon iniquité. So if none of those who brag about the wrong thing can say, I recognize the depth of evil in me, and David can, this is not just a question about I did this or I did that. This is not just I am going to confess my sins. When I hear someone's confession and all I hear is a list of things that they've done, it's like, yes, but who are you? Lots of people do those things. What are you going to do with the fact that you've done those things? What does it say about who you are in the depth? And so David starts it right off. Je reconnais mon iniquité. I know the iniquity, the depth of evil that is in me. The one who can do that, celui-là le peut, qui est capable de souffrir ce qu'il a fait. To feel the suffering of what has been done that is evil. And so this Psalm 50 is giving David his voice, but it's also speaking to the culture where people wanted to criticize Theodosius. A king shouldn't be doing that. Why should a king have to do penance? And yet, Ambrose, because he wants to bring everybody to be able to delight in the things that appear to make no sense, says, look at the truly regal, royal dimension of what David, king, did. Most people can't recognize, I have a depth of evil in me. D'où ce mot du prophète. De ce que vous dites dans vos cœurs, que le remords vous étreigne sur vos couches. And then he goes on this with the example that, did you like the example about the horses? A horse that, I didn't really like it. It didn't seem to fit anything that I know, but I saw what Ambrose was trying to do. It's like, yeah, a horse that falls can't get up by himself. Okay. None of us can. And so that, why would we have done that for a human being who couldn't get up? But the point of it is, if when we've fallen, we just kind of do all sorts of motions and fail to realize where we are. And so closing with, tiens-toi tranquille, shut up for a while, be quiet. If you've fallen, be quiet. So that the next step is perhaps possible. Et ma faute est toujours contre moi. Not only has he confessed his iniquity, but he has confessed his fault. He makes the normal kind of distinction between the l'insensé, the fool, and the wise person. and gives it again, a positive overtone. And then on page 137, right at the top, comme un censeur sévère, il se poursuit lui-même dans un éternel effroi. One of those favorite quotes of Ambrose follows. The person who is his own accuser. So just as at the very beginning of the commentary, Ambrose made sure that David's sin was clear. I am not going to debate the fact of whether he had adultery or whether he murdered. Yes, he did that. Now he turns that same fact in a different direction. Because the just person, Proverbs 18:17, is from his very first word his own accuser. So the fact that David can recognize his iniquity, recognize his sin, now has a new articulation. Be clever enough to say who you are from the very beginning. Because if you say, I'm not a sinner, nobody's going to believe you anyway. If you try to hide from the fact that you are limited and weak. But if you put your sinfulness out there from the beginning, so the truth is part of what is happening. I think we call that humility. My translation of the word humility is truth. That the person who is true to self is a humble person, even if they are great, even if they stand out. Humility doesn't mean to grovel, to kind of crawl on the ground. It means being true, being honest. And so the just person is from his own first word, his own accuser. Because it clears away the nonsense. And it allows the conversation to move forward. How do you translate that out of any modern philosopher? I'm not an expert here at all. But I'll be willing to bet that you will find it in a lot of places in a philosophical textbook or in the reasoning that goes on in philosophy. I mean, this is not just a kind of a religious attitude. This is a way of presenting oneself and of being within the world. Qui s'accuse est juste, qui est juste et sage, et saint d'esprit. Le juste ne sait pas se favoriser, so the just person isn't looking for mere personal favor. Il ne sait pas fléchir, même pour lui-même, la rigueur d'un jugement. He doesn't play games with words so as to change the value of a judgment, of a decision. Il est pris d'horreur au souvenir de sa propre chute et il rugit de l'égarement. He knows when he's fallen and he's embarrassed by it. Tout ressouvenir de sa faute, il le craint, il le redoute, il recule de peur devant lui. Il se juge pernicieux pour lui-même, se récuse lui-même comme juge et n'ose pas s'en remettre à lui-même. Does Ambrose exaggerate that to some small degree? I think so. But again, the sense of this being not something that is the heights of a spirituality without it also being the best of a philosophy. Paragraph 148, or paragraph 48. violente est l'âpreté de la conscience coupable. So when somebody knows that he or she has not done well, there's a certain interior violence that is recognizable. And oftentimes, he goes on to say, well, Adam and Eve, they hid. They ran away. You know, who of us, when we've done something stupid, doesn't want to hide the fact? Nobody wants to admit that they've been dumb. Et ma faute est toujours contre moi. C'est-à-dire, sans relâche, le souvenir et la vue même de mon égarement m'assaillent. The realization that I didn't get it right. Vois comment nous sommes plongés dans la confusion. Celui qui a honte de ce qu'il a commis ne peut plus rien commettre de pareil qui le fasse semblement rougir. That paragraph 49 is a re-emphasis of what I said to begin with about the relationship between sin and iniquity. At the bottom of page 139, he cites Psalm 31, verse 1, just as that phrase from Proverbs, the just person from the very first word is his own accuser, is found all over the works of Ambrose, from early to late. So too the Psalm 31 verse 1 is found. Blessed are those whose iniquities have been forgiven and whose sins have been covered. And so the language of doing good works to cover over sin is all about the that which happens in relationship to penance, whether it be penance for serious sin or penance for less serious sin. It's the penance that follows baptism. Whereas the first part of the phrase, blessed are those whose iniquities have been forgiven, refers to baptism. And Ambrose is quite explicit in using that verse again and again to show the distinction between the water of baptism and the tears of penance. Binding them both together with liquid, recognizing their difference as sacraments in their relationship to iniquity and to sin, in their relationship to interiority and good work. So there's a certain consistency around the thought of Ambrose when it comes to pulling together the meaning of the human person faced with his own evil and his sin, when faced with the baptism to be celebrated or already celebrated, and the penance that prepares for one or that is part of the other. And if those two phrases are characteristic of Ambrose, two more scriptural phrases are here in the same context. One has to do with the charity that covers a multitude of sins. First letter of Peter, chapter 4, verse 8. And the second is the phrase from Luke, chapter 7, verse 47, where she was forgiven much because she loved much. Again, 4 different scriptural verses that you find Ambrose commenting on again and again and again, almost always in the context that over the first several verses of his commentary on Psalm 50 have been explained. Pause for a minute. Back in 1970, I was a student in Paris. I went to someone who had been requested by a third party if he'd be willing to accept me as a thesis student. So I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do for my doctoral thesis. I wanted to study confession in the early church. And my director, Charles Pietri, said, good topic. He says, I think you should find another director. And I said, Professor, what would you like to suggest that I do? Because I wanted him as my director. I didn't want my topic. I wanted him. And what he told me to do was to discover as many images on the sarcophagi of the 4th century, as many images as I could find that included Christ, Peter, and a rooster. And the interest, so this was my introduction to Ambrose. Christ, Peter, and the rooster. So I began at the beginning of the 4th century. I found a few examples from late 3rd century, a whole bunch from the early years of the 4th century. And I began to notice that as the century went on, the rooster went from the ground to a pedestal, to a column, to a tree. I've never seen a rooster in a tree. I'm sure they find their way there, but it just didn't make any sense to me. So what's going on here? Well, because of the fact that that there was a group of people who said, if you've done something serious, you cannot be forgiven. In the time following St. Cyprian, in the middle of the 3rd century, people barely began in the West, to use the example of Peter as someone who did a sin at least as serious as anybody else. He denied Christ. And began to say, well, if I can't be forgiven, why did Peter get forgiven? And so putting this image on the sarcophagi, it appears at the late 3rd century, it disappears by the beginning of the 5th century. So it's an image that is popular for a little more than 100 years. And as the rooster goes higher and higher, it's clear that the rooster has become merely decorative. It's no longer deeply connected to the scripture. I've got to give a place to the rooster. No. The key is Peter and Christ. The rooster is incidental. The rooster is a way of saying, look at the relationship we're talking about. When Christ looked at Peter, Peter did penance. The rooster is incidental. By the time of Ambrose, the rooster has become too important, decorative, on a pedestal. And so in the verses that follow, where he brings in the example of Peter and talks about Peter's repentance, he's building on a tradition that has been going on at least since the two documents, De Novatianis and De Rebaptizoribus, of the years 265 or so. And he's building on it in a way that says, what's really important here is that people recognize that no matter how deep the evil, no matter how serious the sin, what matters is the remissio peccatorum. Make sense? What sorts of questions do the things that I've already talked about raise for you? Isan. Allez-y. Ambrose is a lawyer. expert in law. Meaning, how in the world could he have even written it? It was probably preached and then touched up and published. We don't really know, but I think Ambrose was someone who learned to speak on his feet. He's a good rhetorician. He knows how to put his mind together to something. The stenographers take it down, and then he published it after checking it over. If I understood the question, it's how in the world did Ambrose get to a point where he could seem to allow anything and everything that you call sin, right? Seems that everything's right, everything's okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. At the time of Cyprian, there was a man named Novatian in Rome and a priest named Novatian in Carthage. The one in Rome said, "You cannot be forgiven." Those who followed the one in Carthage said, "Don't worry about it, you're always forgiven." Ambrose has to make sure he's on neither side. And Augustine, after him, is still talking about people who do both things. Some who say you can't, and some who say, "Don't worry, you are forgiven." So how do the two of them kind of walk this not so narrow path in between the total freedom, everything goes, and the legalistic approach that says this is the way it must be? And I think Ambrose does that with the language of good works. Meaning, it's not that you can just be forgiven. Because if the sin was serious, the time of penance could be the rest of your life. You know, the canons of the church seem even harsher than some of the words of people like Ambrose or Maximus or Peter Chrysologus in the way they talk about penance on the Italian peninsula. So his way of walking that middle area has to have been deeply difficult, because someone comes to me and says, "I've done this." And it isn't just something the person did once, but you can see a whole pattern here. The person's almost an addict. Well, if I come in with the full force of the law, saying no change is going to happen, you need to, as Augustine will say in a letter later, I struggle with how do I make sure that I'm not so heavy, so hard that I lose someone, or so delicate that I let them continue to ruin the community. So walking this road between l'anarchie of the individual, which is the temptation we have today, at least in my country, and this sense of social order and the needs of others is something we rarely get much of a clear picture about because it is so personalized. Do read letter 93 of Augustine, 93 or 95, to Paulinus of Nola. And I think it's paragraph 3 where he describes the anguish of making sure I'm not too heavy-handed and not too simple-minded. And I think all of the bishops had to confront that issue because the law, as law, was a hammer. As far as we can tell from the canonical language, it was difficult. I mean, my thesis was an effort. Cyril Vogel had done great work on the canonical tradition of penance throughout the West and beyond. And I tried for the writers of the Italian peninsula in the year between the years 300 and 460 to ask the simple question, what about everyday penance? What is there that we can take from sermons or letters or other things that will help us see the base, what I call the base of the mountain? So if canonical penance is like the peak, it's got to sit on something. What's it sitting on? What are people living? How does this work out in the everydayness of experience? And I think Ambrose was one of the best examples I had in the thesis because he was, even though I didn't have his sermons, we have almost nothing from, as it were, the stenographer. It's all from Ambrose's hand. He still gave me lots of room to kind of see who he was talking about and how he was making distinctions between people who are good at heart and who made some really bad decisions, or people who are just weak and don't know how to make good decisions. And then those that he calls insensés, the fools, who don't seem to have any interior compass at all. So that doesn't answer the question fully, but it's a great question because it not only speaks to that time and to ours, but it's a philosophical question. It's a matter of how do I get my mind straight so I'm thinking in ways that are not just intellectual, but are human. Other comments? Questions? I hope I can be clever enough to respond to that because it does sound very personal. And if I put the emphasis on baptism and penance, the forgiveness of the depth of evil within me, and the working out of the sins that I in fact commit. It could be deeply personal. But I think he goes beyond that. And I think your question is saying, this isn't just a question of, I want to classify the depth of sins that are called iniquitas in relation to baptism. I recognize that it might also be a part of who I am. And I can't remember right now when it starts to come up a little bit more fully, but it's when the verse of Psalm 50 starts to talk about being born in sin from the sein de ma mère, from the very first instant. I think the depth of iniquitas doesn't just go away because of baptism. So it may not be operative in the same way, depending upon whether or not I've let grace, the grace of being a member of the community, being baptized, to be active, or whether I've turned it off and moved away from it. But I don't think the iniquitas in any single human being goes away. But he wants to emphasize the fact that it doesn't become fully, it need not become operative. At least that is the way I would understand not only what he's already done, because I think in some ways he's laying the foundation for being able to talk about the rest of, about the places in the psalm where he says, I was born, from the very first moment I'm a sinner, and the prayer, create a clean heart in me, O God. So how does that, create a clean heart for me, O God, and don't take your Holy Spirit away from me, which is like the hinge of the whole psalm is right there in verse 12, where this, I'm bad, I've done these things, verses 3 to 7 started off, and then I'm born in sin, a lot of the negativity, and then we get this turn toward what must I do with this fact of who I am? If Augustine says that we are all in some ways part of this lump, this massa damnata, Ambrose never uses the language. But that's what he's saying. We're all a part, we all deserve condemnation. Not because of anything we've done, but we're born in sin, in that condition of separation from God. And so belonging to Christ, and in those days that meant being baptized in physical terms. They did not speak very much, if at all, about baptism of desire, although baptism, martyrdom, was certainly part of that. Being baptized then becomes this huge demand, necessity, because unless I belong to Christ, I remain of this group that's condemned. And so salvation in Christ, in other words, is meant to do away with the impact, the power, the guiding importance of iniquitas. Thankfully, our reflection today hasn't left the question in those particular terms. We've changed the question to the point of doing some of the things he also does, but maybe doesn't do quite enough for our own taste, is what about everybody else? Can a Hindu be saved is a question I'm sometimes, or a Muslim be saved? What about these other people? And there is no good theological answer to that. Meaning, I'm I'm always left with a parable. It's kind of a silly parable, but it's the only one I've ever found that I could use. It's Adam and Eve left heaven, and somebody blew up the bridge. No way back. Christ built the bridge. His name is on it. He's the architect. He's the builder. He's the everything. Anybody who can find their way to the bridge can walk across it, whether they know the builder or not. Now, I suspect that that way of talking would have been very difficult for an Ambrose or for Augustine because their times and their questions were different. So I am not going to propose either one of them as answering all of our questions. But I think it's also helpful to be able to articulate limits and say, well, what is Augustine talking about when he talks, or Ambrose talking about when they say so-and-so is in the bosom of Abraham? Oh, okay, that's a little bit, yeah, that's a nice movement in the direction of all people may be saved. They don't spend any time with it. It's not their question. So did I come close to giving, let's say that's my best answer for your question as far as I can go with it. Another. So dream up. Go ahead. No, I just didn't hear. Meaning the odd thing about sin and recognizing sin is that because it's bad, we don't want to talk about it, but unless we name it, we can't ever overcome it. Yes. Meaning connect that also to the Confessions. I won't try to do that explicitly, but if you read the first several paragraphs of Book 10 of the Confessions, I think you'll find that what I'm going to say fits right there. Because my sense is that we all know that if we get sick and we don't know why we are sick, and nobody can tell us why this sickness, why this is happening, it's very uncomfortable. But as soon as it has a name, it's easier to live with, no matter how serious that name might be. It's at least, I know what I'm dealing with. And so this need to recognize one's sin is Ambrose's way of saying, please reclaim your humanity. Be the human being you are. Accept the human condition that is ours. Reclaim your humanity. Because when you name who you are, then you can become better at being who you are. And so confession of sin, instead of being that thing to be afraid of, is the very thing that looks negative and is positive. It's a shame that we have failed, and generally I think we have failed, to put this confession to God, confession to friend, confession to priest, all in a similar context. Because there are a lot of things I don't have to go to a priest to confess, but I'll tell my friends. In subtle ways, but, and, having a human being whose mouth has to be shut after he's heard what you say can be a very liberating way of naming what you must yet become, rather than a matter of mere shame or whatever. And I'm not sure that we've put all that together. But even if the confession to a friend and the confession to a priest remain in the shadows and of lesser importance, the confession to God is something nobody can do without. Because if I don't take the worst of my life and put it, as it were, in front of my eyes, I may never deal with it. And therefore everybody else has to. There's the challenge. But if I can take the worst of my life and stand or sit or pray before my Creator and say, this is who I am. Did you make me this way? Why do I do this? Why am I like this? You said I'm supposed to be good. What's going on here? Well, then it becomes, it's gripping, it grips you in the belly. I mean, it's like, whereas to fail to do that is just to kind of live superficially. So it's not about to whom so much as it is about who I am. If that makes sense. Let's take a 10-minute break. I'm sure we all I certainly need it by now. We'll see you in 10 minutes. Paragraphs that begin, paragraph 51, contre toi seul j'ai péché. Once again, Ambrose will provide more than one explanation of that particular verse. I think there are three of them that kind of come one after the other. Oui, il était roi, et aucune loi ne lui liait personnellement, car les rois échappent aux chaînes que nous valent nos fautes. Kings are special, they get away with a lot, and yet, even though he was king, and could have gotten away with it, he did not. Il n'a donc pas péché contre un homme. So Ambrose recognizes that what David is saying is that his sin is not just a sin against anybody, it's a sin against God. Mais bien que protégé par le pouvoir souverain, il était néanmoins, par sa piété et sa foi, soumis à Dieu. That kind of picks up what I said at the very end of the previous hour about confession. It's, the confession to God was the normal, and it is certainly the basic understanding of the word confession. So, par sa piété et sa foi soumis à Dieu. It is clear that that language applies to David. I think it's pretty clear that that language could also apply to Theodosius. And I say that because, as I said yesterday, it seems to me that Ambrose is in some way not only talking about let's follow the example of David, but let's cut Theodosius a break. Let's not criticize him for having done penance, but recognize the extraordinary benefit to us of his penance, because he recognized himself as subject to the law of God. Nous pouvons aussi comprendre de la manière suivante. So it's not just you confess only to God. Qui peut me juger, puisque tous sont sous le joug du péché? C'est pourquoi le Seigneur a dit à propos de la femme adultère que celui qui est sans péché soit le premier à lui jeter la pierre. So not only is David recognizing that his sin is against God, but another way of taking that same phrase is only God is capable of being the judge. God is the only one who can throw the stone. So do not only recognize his piété, his faith, but also don't be the one who puts yourself in the place of God. I think it's Sermon 13 of Augustine that he does the same commentary of the woman taken in adultery as Ambrose does here. Then on page 145, contre toi, dit-il, j'ai péché, et devant toi j'ai fait le mal, en sorte que tu es justifié dans tes paroles et que tu triomphes quand tu es jugé. So, as I mentioned yesterday, to pay some attention to the language of justification, language that was very difficult for the members of the Reformation, and which remains a difficulty between Catholic and Lutheran Christians, finds in Ambrose this sense that God is not just the one who justifies. God is justified, that is, he's proven right when sin is acknowledged. So it's not only a kind of self-awareness that comes out of the confession of sin for Ambrose. It's also a situation or a situating of oneself within the economy of salvation. Because it says, no, God is not the author of my sin. God is justified in his judgments when I acknowledge my sin. Nous recusons le témoignage de l'homme, et c'est en ta présence que nous commettons des actions indignes de toi. Voir les turpitudes de l'homme, c'est subir une injure. Nous savons que Dieu est le témoin de tout, et c'est devant ce témoin, précisément, que nous péchons. So whether one takes the point of view of toward God alone or toward God as the only one who can judge, or as a way of recognizing the justice or the rightness of God's judgment, it is a verse that acknowledges that God alone is the true witness to what is going on. And so, in the middle of paragraph 52, et pourtant, c'est en cela que le Seigneur notre Dieu est pu pleinement justifier, car notre injustice met en relief la justice de Dieu. Notre mensonge proclame la vérité de Dieu. Or, si Dieu est véridique, tout homme est menteur. Les paroles de Dieu sont pleines de vérité, de justice, et c'est pourquoi est vrai tout ce que le Seigneur a dit touchant la fragilité humaine. So this question of is not whether or not God is true, but how I relate to God. And I basically, whoever the I is, I relate to God as someone who is part of the human condition, can be called as unjust, liar. But it talks about everything that touches la fragilité humaine. So he's not talking primarily here about the iniquitas, the depth of evil within me, so much as the reality of my weakness. And so in the Latin on that page 144, quia inclinatum est cor eorum ad nequitiam, propendit ad fraudem. Le cœur des hommes est enclin à l'iniquité. Not that it's seized by iniquity, but it is inclined toward iniquity. Ils tendent à la ruse. Et aussi ce qu'il a déclaré formellement, étant donné qu'il n'y ait pas d'homme qui soit pécheur, tous, en effet, se sont détournés et se sont pervertis. Pour cette raison, il triomphe quand il est jugé. The human being is triumphant when the human being is judged. Which is an odd way of putting it. Car avec la chute de tous dans le péché, il a fourni la preuve de tout ce qu'il avait dit. Though if our sin proves that God is just, and every time we fall, we show how right God is, should we therefore sin all the more? That's Paul's question. I think it's chapter 6 of the letter to the Romans. Well, if grace is more, when sin is more, does that mean I should sin so I can get more grace? Meaning Christian logic has to face that question, whether you are Paul the Apostle, Ambrósio of Milão, or Allan Fitzgerald, or whatever other name you want to put there. Because it looks wrong. It looks like it's more than a paradox. But the paradox is that it is precisely in being judged and allowing oneself to be judged, and therefore confessing so that one might be judged, that the plan of God works its way out in the most positive sense. If that makes any sense. En conséquence, si nous déclarons que nous avons commis l'iniquité, nous justifions le Seigneur. Mais si nous déclarons que nous n'avons pas péché, nous faisons de Dieu un menteur. Why would we want to call God a liar? So that whole section really doesn't say much more than that, but it goes around that issue of, well, how do we talk about justification? I was asked a year ago to give a paper on Ambrose's meaning of justice. And quite frankly, I never found out how I could give that paper. It's still something that has to be done. But at least one part of trying to understand Ambrose's understanding of justice is the paradox. The paradox of how the word justification can be used in two senses and not just in one, without any fear of being misunderstood. So on page 149. Dans le même procès, considère de quelle manière le Seigneur s'est offert à David lui-même pour être jugé afin de triompher. So this isn't just that we justify God or that God justifies us. It's that Ambrose even came up with a place where God put himself out, allowed himself to be judged. Nathan, en effet, dit en effet, voici les paroles du Seigneur Dieu. C'est moi qui t'a donné l'onction royale pour que tu règnes sur Israël, et c'est moi qui t'ai délivré des mains de Saoul, qui t'ai donné tout ce qui appartient à ton maître, et ses femmes sur son sein. Et je t'ai donné la maison d'Israël lui-même. Et si c'est trop peu, j'y ajouterai encore. Pourquoi n'as-tu fait aucun cas du Seigneur au point de commettre l'iniquité sous ses yeux? Pressé par le rappel de ses bienfaits, voyant qu'il avait le dessous, lorsqu'il juge, David dit, « J'ai péché contre le Seigneur. » Le cas, c'est que David a voulu... the situation was that David wanted to number the people, and he was not supposed to do that. So Nathan confronts him and says, look, giving you all this, and you still do the very thing you knew that you were not supposed to do. And what did David answer? J'ai péché contre le Seigneur. I am a sinner. I mean, the Lord gave him a chance to be judged, gave David a chance to judge him, and instead David said, no, I'm the problem. C'est ainsi qu'il a justifié le Seigneur, lui qui n'a pas osé nier son péché. Now, all of this kind of wraps back into the question that we began with about confession. One of the other phrases that Ambrose likes to quote a lot is from Isaiah 43 at the bottom of page 149. Déclare toi-même tes iniquités afin d'être justifié. And Ambrose comments on that just barely above. Du fait qu'il ne niait pas, il faisait par suite pénitence de son égarement, et ainsi, par aveu de sa faute, il justifiait le Seigneur, et il était lui-même justifié par le Seigneur. So the justification is mutual, not in every case, but in the case of the acknowledgement of one's sin. Comments or questions? In some ways, that's the first section of Psalm 50 that in some ways says the same thing in a lot of ways, but where it appears to put more emphasis on what the sin is, or what confession means, or how we talk about that in terms of justification. It's really saying the same thing in several different ways. in what follows now, we begin to talk about the make sure I didn't miss it. Okay, I was going to jump ahead. I shouldn't do that. So in what follows then, we begin to talk about Ambrose's sense of original sin. Voici la suite. J'ai été conçu dans mes iniquités, et c'est dans les fautes que ma mère m'a mis au monde. He'll go on to say, pretty much in the same way that Origen said, well, whose sin are we talking about? Is it the sin of the infant, the sin of the parents? What does that mean? He doesn't answer that in any clear way. But at the bottom of page 151, nous sommes donc conçus dans le péché de nos parents, et c'est dans leur faute que nous naissons. And as negative as that looks, he goes on to recognize how many of our own questions today were his questions then. So the bringing to birth was not the only contagium, souillure, the French translate it. Marriage is a good thing. Conjugal union is a good, holy thing. And yet, que ceux qui ont une épouse soient comme s'ils n'en avaient pas, citing Paul. Marriage is pure, and neither spouse should refuse to the other. Unless perhaps, again, quoting Paul, it's for having a time to pray. Dès lors, selon l'apôtre, on n'est pas libre pour la prière dans le temps où on pratique cette union charnelle. Et le linge de la femme est impur au jour de menstru, et elle ne peut, en ces jours-là, offrir le sacrifice de sa purification. Citing Jewish law. C'est pourquoi le Seigneur déclare à celui chez qui il n'a voulu aucune souillure venant d'une telle origine. Avant de te former au sein de ta mère, je t'ai connu. Avant que tu fusses sorti de ses entrailles, je t'ai consacré. Je t'ai établi prophète au milieu des nations. So now instead of, as it were, going into the depth of, well, what are you talking about? What is original sin? Whose fault is it? How does it happen? He breaks off the discussion and turns our attention to Jesus Christ, who was born without sin. My summary of that would be, I don't think Ambrose knew any better than we do how to talk about what original sin really is, how it's transmitted, and what that really means. We kind of fiddle around with it the way I did the other day. But the rest of that paragraph then turns its attention to the one who was born without fault. He has at least recognized that there's nothing bad about marriage, there's nothing bad about sexual intercourse, there's nothing bad about parents, and yet somehow the sin is there nonetheless. C'est donc avec raison que David, page 155, a déploré avec tristesse la présence en lui-même des souillures de la nature, puisque chez l'homme, la souillure commence même avant la vie. So there's something about this that is not reasonable. So that from which we must be saved, he has talked about, and so in some ways now he has to say, having put Christ at the center the forefront of attention. He now has to talk about, well, what is this forgiveness of sin that Jesus Christ brings to our midst? And paragraph 58 and 59. We have enough hands. We'll go deeper into that. I'm not sure that we need to spend a lot of time on that. The bottom of page 155. Voici que tu as aimé la vraie réalité. Tu m'as révélé ce qui est indéterminé et caché en ta sagesse. So somehow the presence of Christ, who brings the remission of sin, has put us at the center of what Ambrose will, for the next several lines or paragraphs, call mystery. What is the mystery of Christ? What is the mystery of the sacrament? What is the mystery of baptism, transfiguration, human joy? And that will take us at least over to page 160. But voici que tu as aimé la vraie réalité. Les mystères eux-mêmes ne sont pas indéterminés, au contraire. Les secrets et les arcanes de ta sagesse ne sont pas indéterminés, mais ils ne sont pas révélés. Excuse me. They're not undetermined. They're not, but we don't know about them because they're not revealed. Much of what Ambrose does in finding the shadow of the Old Testament and the reality of the New is to work, as it were, in between those two poles, those two positions. And so in trying to think about well, what is the wisdom of God, and how do we know about the wisdom of God, and how is that part of the mystery that we celebrate? On page 157, c'est pourquoi, voyant ces choses, il dit, voici que désormais, ce n'est pas dans l'ombre, ce n'est pas en figure, ce n'est pas dans un symbole, mais c'est en réalité que la lumière manifeste, devenue manifeste, resplendit. Maintenant, je contemple la réalité, Jesus Christ, obviously. Je perçois la splendeur de la réalité. Et maintenant, ô Seigneur notre Dieu, je te vénère avec un plus grand amour. Pas dans un miroir, pas dans un énigme. C'est face à face. Voilà les vrais secrets de ta sagesse qui purifient les secrets de l'esprit. Et je te saisis dans tes mystères. Which in the Latin, te intuis teneo sacramentis. And while it's true that the word sacrament and the word mystery often is the same in Ambrose, in this case, I think the translation should have said sacraments, not mysteries. Because he's talking about seeing something that has a physical, seeable proportion. C'est pourquoi désormais joyeux et assuré, il dit au Seigneur, tu m'aspergeais avec l'hysope et je serai purifié. Tu me laveras, je serai plus blanc que neige. So it's the sacrament of baptism that is the focus. And he will go on through the rest of paragraph 59 to talk about what is this spiritual change that takes place through the celebration of baptism. Continuing to cite from from Psalm 50, page 161, tu me feras entendre la joie et la grâce, et les os humiliés exulteront. So there's a certain movement that's come from this cleansing through the sacraments that has now become joy. And he wants to talk about these bones, that which was crushed, as the people of the church, page 163. And I think it's a rather important little paragraph, that one at the top of 163. Sont appelés aussi os, le peuple des églises. Not just of the church, but of the churches. C'est pourquoi tu trouves cette parole dans le psaume. Ce que tu as fait dans le secret n'est pas caché à mon os. Il a appelé son os l'Église et les saints réunions du peuple pieux, car nous sommes les membres du corps du Christ et de sa propre chair et de ses os. Il exprime ainsi, parce que l'Église du Seigneur connaîtra toutes les œuvres divines et recevra la certitude de la résurrection. So what's happened there, or I should say where Ambrose has gone in the flow of his thought, is that moving from the question of justification to the means of justification to the expression in good works, is that he's had to highlight the people who have been and are the baptized, who are members of the church, and who, because of that fact, know the works of God. Because the church of the Lord will recognize all of the divine works and will receive the certitude of resurrection. I think that's another kind of section, a nice moment to pause and say, are there comments or questions? Ce n'est même pas exprimé ici. C'est-à-dire, il ne parle même pas de l'amour, mais de l'action de Dieu qui correspond à... He doesn't just talk, he's not talking really about love, but about how God's action corresponds to mine. Meaning, it's certainly true that love fits everything. But just in terms of the language that Ambrose is using, and the thrust of what he's trying to do here is not so much reflect upon the good works that cover sin, the love that covers sin, or even the love that comes from my heart. He's talking about justification, washing, recognition of the presence of God in the sacraments. That is, and not just the 7 sacraments or one, but of course we can talk about that. But Ambrose is not. Meaning, yes, that's behind everything, above everything, over everything. But that's not where he's placing the emphasis. Isam? And I think that in the text that Ambrose is using, although he will affirm that it is the parent's sin, he does not want us to think that therefore we need to point the finger at somehow the parents did something wrong, as if marriage or the marital act were bad. And so he steps away from in the same way that Origen did, he steps away from saying, well, we have to say it was this person's sin or that person's sin. No. It's the human condition. And, right. Meaning, as often as Ambrose and Augustine and the Christian tradition will say that the sin of the parents is passed on. Which parents? Adam and Eve? Or Henry and Doris? So, meaning the thrust of this tradition, if we narrow it too tightly to one person, one family, one generation, we miss the fact that what he's really talking about is the mortality of humanity. And our mortality, if we believe the story of Genesis, didn't begin with any one of us. It was all my parents or your parents could give you. They gave you life, but it was mortal life, limited by weakness and ignorance. And so I'm not trying to finesse the question so much as make sure that it doesn't get so limited that we're pointing the finger at this sin or that sin. And I think that's what Ambrose did in that section on original sin. That makes sense. I think there's no question but that is language that I think Ambrose could be comfortable using if he were living today. I think it's also true that as I mentioned yesterday, that by the time we get to Augustine, to say that we justify God was unthinkable. Not because it isn't true, but because language patterns and the arrival of the critical question of the need for grace had become more crucial, more prominent. So, yes, confession of sin is a way of gaining self-knowledge. But I think Ambrose is emphasizing not only that, and maybe not even especially that, but it's a way of making sure that the I is part of that larger picture. So that my actions become fully a part of God's plan insofar as I acknowledge who I am as a sinner. And so yes, that gains self-knowledge for me, and yes, that is important, and today that becomes could even become today the focus. But that would misunderstand what Ambrose is trying to do. If he were today, he wouldn't be going in so much in that direction as in the way of saying, and because you know yourself, therefore you are and can be united more closely with God. So it doesn't lose that confession is a way of self-knowledge. It just makes sure that that isn't the primary phrase, if that makes sense. So, paragraph 61 and then 62, détourne ta face de mes péchés. It becomes a kind of a spiritual interpretation. It's aussi est-ce avec raison que David dit à Dieu de détourner son visage, non pas de sa personne, mais de ses péchés, afin que ses péchés ne puissent plus avoir de force. So the prayer isn't, don't look at me, as if to say, I didn't do it, but don't look at my sins, because if God forgets our sins, then they disappear. They are not. They have no being. So at the bottom of the page, il faut donc prier qu'il nous regarde, because we want him to look at us, mais qu'il détourne sa face de nos péchés afin de les effacer. Car ces choses qu'il ne regarde pas, il les efface. Et des choses qu'il a effacées, le souvenir disparaît. Comme le Seigneur lui-même l'a dit, c'est moi, oui, c'est moi qui efface tes iniquités, et j'en aurai plus de souvenirs. Et toi, garde-en le souvenir, et allons ensemble en justice. So, he in some ways has come, full circle, so that he can begin paragraph 62 with, well, okay, sin. It's either forgiven, wiped out, or hidden. It's forgiven by per gratiam, donator per gratiam, wiped out by the blood of the cross, covered over by charity, and here we go with the love. Il en va de même pour l'iniquité, que l'on tient pour la manière d'être durable d'un esprit qui n'agit pas selon la justice, bien que Jean, dans sa lettre, affirme que celui qui a commis le péché a commis aussi l'iniquité. oh, what's going on here? Is he bringing those two words back together? C'est donc une chose de plus grande importance que l'iniquité elle-même soit effacée, que soit arrachée la racine et la sémence des péchés. Any good Stoic would have been able to say that. There's nothing specifically Christian about the word, about the thought, even if the words are Christian. Que la mauvaise racine soit enlevée pour qu'elle ne porte pas de mauvais fruits. Que tout attachement à l'erreur soit aboli, que toutes les formes de l'iniquité soient enlevées. C'est pourquoi, de même qu'au moment précis où elle pénètre dans l'âme, la loi de la sagesse chasse la folie. La science expulse l'ignorance. Et même la vertu parfaite efface l'iniquité et la rémission des péchés détruit tout péché. Paragraph 62, in other words, ends up being a kind of a summary of many of the things that have gone before, does maintain the separation or the difference between iniquity and sin, but it goes very clearly at, and so if we need to, where we need to do the work and accept the grace of God is precisely on the root, which is the basic root of evil that is in us. And so 63, he wants to do away with the influence of Eve and make us part of the life of Christ. So far, so good. I think we're close to the end. How much time do I still have here? So, good. Paragraph 64. I said earlier, it's something of the hinge of the psalm. Crée en moi un cœur pur, renouvelle un esprit droit dans mes entrailles. So it's not just a matter of getting one's head straight. It's into the depth of one's being. And then he'll go on to say, and make sure you don't take away from me your Holy Spirit. Because, and that paragraph 65. Chez l'homme nouveau, so the person who has become Christian, the heart is pure. Because the tash, the dirtiness of previous faults have been wiped away. And c'est un grand privilège, la purification du cœur. Christ said, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God." C'est pour cette raison que David désirait avoir un cœur pur, afin de n'être pas rejeté loin de la face du Seigneur. So Ambrose will spend some time about what it means to be seen or not seen, that is, what it means to be before God's face or hidden from God. But the create a clean heart in me, O God, is connected to the beatitude of the Gospel of Matthew. And because in that way, there's a purification that takes within. So 65, it's where 64 is about l'homme nouveau, 65 is chez celui dont le cœur est pur. L'esprit est renouvelé en son intérieur. How do we talk about the within? What are the words to be used that will somehow help us to express what does it mean to have an interior life? We're probably not going to use the language of Ambrose, les entrailles de l'âme. I don't really think of my soul as having a gut. And yet that's what he's talking about here. Les entrailles de l'âme, ce sont les exercices de découverte du sens de l'écriture. Remember the very first words of this work, to get to the power of the scriptures, the interior quality of them. So the discovery of the meaning of the scriptures, good thoughts, practice of virtue, fidelity, and enfin ce qu'on appelle en grec enoivai, les conceptions. Mais l'esprit droit, paragraph 66, will kind of pull that together and set up all the things that follow. Mais l'esprit droit, c'est-à-dire celui qui dirige bien, qui mène dans la voie droite, c'est l'esprit de vérité. So somehow the Spirit of God and the infusion of the Spirit of God within is something that we all have, and something that in fact prepares not only the rest of this work, but the rest of Christian life. Ne me rejette pas loin de ta face, ne me retire pas ton Esprit Saint. I'm going to stop there, because I think we've kind of, as it were, reached the culminating point of the work, even though some of this will work its way out in further expression of what it means for David to be the one who prays for a clean heart and for the maintenance of the Holy Spirit. And he will place some more in the verses that follow on what does it mean to remain before the face of God. What does it mean to one's personal spirit to have the Spirit? But I think that's all set up adequately in what has already been said. Are there any questions? Christian. Mm-hmm.
I can understand the second phrase, maybe, that the text also from our intellect, the word of God. So maybe that's why everyone can try one explanation, because it seems that we are working to do the interpretation. But in fact, our intellect is being taught by another word.
Mm-hmm.
That's the truth. So when we are trying to comment it, we are being purified or formed in some kind of way. And that's why maybe
Mm-hmm. I think Ambrose is doing it not because the subject is so vast, but because he has read more than one interpretation. And he knows that one can be as good as another. In Book 12 of the Confessions, Augustine has 7 different interpretations. You wonder whether he's just trying to get the 7 days in there, but whatever it might be, the 7 days of creation. But I think the honesty of saying as you're saying, that when we hear the word and interpret it, it doesn't. It's not necessarily satisfying one single interpretation, because it can strike. I can read someone else's interpretation and disagree. So the only thing that becomes important is not how many, but that they all be true. And so that any interpretation you want is good as long as it's true. And then we have a wonderfully long conversation about, well, what does it mean to be true? Right? But the basic principle of exegesis, I believe, is respected in several places here where he says, and some do this, and some also say, or it can be added that, because he knows that several people have taken this in different ways. And since he has been accused of copying from others, I think in some way he's saying, yes, I've read this other, and I also have my own. And there's nothing wrong with that or even another. Not very profound, but I think it's right. Anything else? Yes. Okay. Mm. Yes. At least in this work, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
By practicing good acts and in further, or the interesting study of emotional betrayal.
Yes.
When he said, well, just like the body has betrayal, the soul has intelligible betrayal.
Mm-hmm.
And then he almost makes a classification of all the possible capacities of the soul, and so there are the sense, knowledge, the good thinking, the pratique de vertu.
But it's really the study of virtue, yes. Mm-hmm.
Lastly, what the Greeks would call annoyance.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question is, here always also that here
Mm-hmm. This, and then all of a sudden they're gone. I think it's a great question for a couple of reasons. I've often been perplexed at moments where Ambrose appears to be talking to the philosophers in his audience, and then the thoughts are gone. Though the work on Interpellatio Iobet David, all of a sudden he's talking about the abyss, and don't spend all of your time thinking about the abyss, because certain philosophers apparently were doing that, and he doesn't do anything with it. And here either he does nothing with this. So is he kind of making a nod to the intellectuals in his community? And there had to have been such, but he doesn't spend any time. I don't know. But it's a fascinating question, because you will find many places where it happens. And if you were to spend some time with the work on De Jacobit Anima, a very perplexing but fruitful reflection that will take this much further than what's here, than maybe the beginnings of a deeper appreciation of why that question could be more important than it looks. But I don't have a good question for it. It's the work on Jacob. Yeah, de Jacob et Anima. I hope I quoted it right. Well, I said at the beginning, thank you. Now let me say at the end, thank you. It's been delightful to be with you, and I hope that my English will give way to your language the next time I make my way to Portugal.